But okay, let's get started. Thanks, Joe, so much for joining me in this discussion, interview, whatever you want to call it. And you've been working in dialogue for some time, producing lots of great outputs that me and many others have been following. And I thought it would be good to have a discussion because there's a lot of excitement in the dialogue community or externally about like, oh, now people can talk to machines. And this has been out there for a very long time, but has increased a lot these days. So what do you think? Like maybe let's start at a very high level related to the large language models.
Mhm.
Do you think that these, like, we have solved the problem of dialogue, or what are some what are some remaining challenges? Like, what are some good things that already happened in your mind? And then what are
Yeah.
some good things that we should still keep focusing on and push the boundaries further?
I definitely think because of the large language model, the surface form in terms of fluency has improved tremendously, which also helps dialogue. But I think there are many things that are not solved. So first I want to say, for example, ChatGPT is sensational. But at the same time, I want to say it's not really a traditional dialogue that we really thought are like really dialogue system, because it's not mixed initiative, which means that the dialogue system in ChatGPT side is passively responding to humans' instruction. So it never takes control of the conversation. It never pushes its own agenda. So it is totally in the submissive way. So usually when we think about dialogues in traditional sense, it's more about mixed initiative dialogues, that the human takes control at a certain time, the machine takes control at some time. So it's like more dynamic in terms of control the floor. And then we usually we say like the dialogue system should be helpful to complete a task with the human, right? So this is sort of the general structure, and it really relies on a lot of what's the goal of the system, right? So he
Mm-hmm.
will come with a goal usually, and then help this human know how, like sort of the collaboratively complete the goal together with the human. And then the model, the dialogue system model should have certain domain information that being able to sort of complete the task. So I really see that dialogue is just a interface to help people to ground or keep the information flowing to satisfy a certain need of the end users. So like I'll give you an example. So if a system comes and a human comes, what the human knows the best is, in the end of the day, is he satisfied with the experience? Did he actually get the thing that he wanted? While the machine should have certain domain information that the human doesn't have, right? So this creates this kind of information, sort of information gap. The machine doesn't know exactly what the human wants. The machine has, but it has some knowledge about the certain domain. So you can go through, like, sort of the human's advantage is know exactly what he wants. In the end of the day, maybe at first he doesn't know, right? But he's a final evaluator of the system. But he doesn't know a lot of domain information, right? So you need to sort of like come like back and forth, trying to ground yourself in terms of commonalities. For example, the machine can offer some like information about the world, like asking like a clarification questions. For example, do you mean like you want all the data from December, or do you mean that you just want data from December 2023, right? So you have to like do this kind of, because the system knows more about the database, right? But while the human may not know exactly what the database is. So how do you like sort of have a more efficient conversation that you ground back and forth within this conversation to reach your goal efficiently? So that's usually what the task-oriented dialogue system have been doing, like, so for a lot of years. And this like sort of like if you think about real world application, like customer service agents and like booking restaurants, booking flight tickets, like these are the sort of normal things that we have seen. So what I have been proposing, like sort of pushing for the past 5 years, is it's not only the information gap, but also you can also influence and change behavior of users. So here we're talking about persuading people to do more physical exercise. providing emotional support. It's not just the information that matters. It's how you present the information so that you can change people's mind, change people's behavior. So here we're not talking about just semantic information flowing from one side to the other, but also pragmatics, right? How do you change people's like your mindset? So here we are thinking like more complicated things like theory of mind, taking people's like personality, taking people's various like meta information into consideration to restructure your dialogue plan, restructure what strategies you want to use. So here it really comes in that personality role, right? If I ask the same question and a different person asks the same question, but we have different personality, we have different things that the model probably should reply differently. For example, a simple thing like I usually use, like if I say you have to behave yourself, for this particular sentence, if I say it to my son, it just means like I'm trying to bother him. But if I say that to my graduate student, something seriously is going on, right? So it depends on who you are, who you talk to. The semantic information has different implications.
Yeah, these are fantastic. So you said a lot of things, like a lot of important points. So in a way, like the system knows what it has access to, and it can be more proactive. But do you think that the current, like, are there any works that you know of externally that can actually do these things? The person, like, or is just like the context or prompting sufficient for some of these things? I feel no, but I would love to hear your answer. I don't want to bias you, but
yeah, so we have definitely experimenting with prompting to see if we can code a pre-written plan. So this is a paper we just submitted to. We submitted to ACL. It will come out soon, hopefully. So you can have a rule-based dialogue plan, right, and then translate that into a prompt. But that really requires that you have a plan that a human can written out, right? But in reality, for every scenarios, you don't want it to write it yourself. You want the model to learn itself when to do clarification questions, when to do like sort of ground with human. Just so this. So I do have a student Matthew is working on this. Basically, when to ask clarifications based on, for example, insufficient of knowledge, and then how do you ask questions? Like, for example, what type of dialogue act is it? Open questions, or like a yes or no question, or counterfactual questions, right? All these kind of type of way to ask questions could make the conversation more effective based on the scenario. Yes, this is something that we're working on, and we hopefully that is a general model, not just for a specific task.
Exactly, that's very interesting. So the retrieval basically brings you some knowledge, but there are like all forms of issues about that knowledge. You may not be confident about it, or may not be sufficiently meeting the context. And if you can detect and then maybe still provide the information or ask confirmations, that's interesting. Okay, sounds very good. So what are some of the things that you think like are really interesting from the large language models that would be useful, like besides the large language models themselves, like what sort of things that are useful, for example, for you in your own research?
Yeah, for sure. I think the large language model really sort of improves the baseline for a lot of tasks. So we can actually use it for zero-shot settings and few-shot settings, which basically now is basically, think about Lego blocks, right? You have better blocks now, and you can actually use them to assemble new things. I think that's sort of the fundamental change, is because the building block is better. Now you can sort of basically stand on the shoulder of other people to build more complex applications. So things like what I talk about, like for more complex domains, for more complex conversational structures, we can use like building block language model, like do generations nowadays. So we can we also find like large language models might be a good tool for data synthesis, right? So like it was Amazon and your group, my student Max had worked on a couple of different papers on how to synthesize using large language model to synthesize conversational data. How to I have also a student like synthesizing complex dialogue understanding samples, like to
Mhm.
resolve this kind of zip loss, like a sort of extremely low resource settings with complex structure. So you can synthesize these examples using a large language model and do some filtering. So it can save a lot of like effort in terms of human data collection,
Mhm.
which means like you have to have human to uh, collect the data and also annotate the
Exactly.
data, which is very costly. And a lot of times, like we're doing crowdsourcing, the quality of the data is
Mhm.
sometimes hard to
Not that great.
manage.
Yes, yes. No, like data was a problem for such a long time because collecting dialogue data is challenging. And then big companies, they do have their own, but it's customer data. Like you can share it with others. You can make them
Yeah,
public. So I think it's great in that sense that like we can use these models to generate or to probe them to generate the data, the type of depending on the type of the data, it can still be complex, but various types of data can be generated. So you hinted to this a little bit when we were talking about the dialogue policy, but what do you think? Like, should we use these large language models like as a black box and do some post-processing on their outputs or prompting to get the right outputs, or shall we actually seek for open source models that we can fine-tune or do other things? What do you think about the? Because
yeah. So these are great questions. So I think we should have both. So there are works. I think it's important to have the manipulation of the model. For example, I'll give you a very simple application that we did. There is an AI ED paper on that we wanted to teach students English, and we wanted to teach new vocabulary within the conversational context, so they can understand these words in a conversational structure and being able to produce them in conversational structure too. So for large language models that you wanted to insert these words in your generation, it's hard to do that. But you can do prompting, but they're not hard constraints. So these words may change a different form, but it's not exactly the word that you want to practice, right? So what you can do is, for example, in the decoding methods, you can do hard controls to do constrained decoding. Then you will actually have the exact word, right? To be able to like manipulate the decoding method, you have to have the full model, right? So it's important for certain tasks that you wanted to have the full model. And of course, there's also interesting things about latencies, right? GPT-4 is great, but it has huge latencies. If you want to incorporate it in your dialogue system, just like waiting for a minute, people think you're dead, right? So
Yes.
there's like all these kind of technical issues with these large language model APIs that potentially would be hard to sort of simply put it into any applications. But at the same time, like these large language models, if you for like people who want to play with, like to then you sort of really isolate this kind of trainings and like having to manage the load balancing and stuff like that, which is great. But at the same time, for people who wanted to do research, you wanted to make sure that your model is sort of efficient, is doing exactly what you want. Then like have a local model that you can fine tune, that you can do various things on decoding even would be very important.
Actually, yeah, I mean that those are like both very good points. I was thinking of picking up on the control because you mentioned the dialogue policy at the beginning, and now at the control at the level of the word tokens. I think these are two important things for dialogue, especially if we
Yes.
want to have some applications, if you want to have some usable dialogue systems. There could be like some higher level policies that we may want to adopt, or maybe just like the output should have these tokens because that's the whole purpose of the dialogue system.
Yeah.
And for each of these things, I do believe, I mean, there are existing methods that we can use, or we can come up with new ones, but it's super important to have access to these language models and then be able to adapt them or fine tune them or use them in different ways during decoding, during inference time, and so on. So maybe, I mean, I don't know, like if you can think of any way that I can emphasize this message, I will be happy to look at
Yeah.
the additional relevant literature and then grab some pieces. So the persuasion, for sure, I've been following that work with a lot of interest. So
Yeah, I think it's really a dynamic field at the moment
Mhm,
that everybody is looking into it because everybody wants to
Mhm.
try it out, what it can do and what it cannot do. I think in itself, it's a very great way to
Mhm.
educate people what these large language models can do and cannot do. But there are
Mhm.
definitely issues like such as faithfulness, logical deductions, and all these things are
Mhm.
that we have a lot of room to improve, right? So
Mhm.
the same thing
Mhm.
with dialogue is like how do you access database, access web page, how do you interact with like knowledge, structured,
Mhm.
unstructured knowledge. All this is are important questions to improve.
Mhm.
And definitely my group is looking on that too.
Mhm. Mhm. I see. And then you also hinted to so something that I was kind of like hoping, if I look back to the history, back a few years back, I was mainly thinking like we do have different types of dialogue systems, or we do have the social bots, or chit chat,
Mhm.
or informational systems. We do have task oriented, and it feels like the gap is kind of closing, which is a good thing because from the user's perspective, like they don't really know what like if the system that they're talking is task oriented or provides
Yes,
information or can just chit
yes.
chat and so on. So should we still like consider them separately? Like, do you, anything that kind of like um, makes you think like, oh, but they're like these things, like it doesn't fit into this overall framework. We should still consider them separately, or do you feel like no, they're merging? It's a good thing.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think it's really coming down in terms of what. So the reason that we separate them before is like
Mhm,
task-oriented system has certain slots predefined that you can like curate over time, and in order to complete the task. While social dialogue doesn't do
mhm,
not have all these kind of predefined information to request from the user. I think that's
mhm,
sort of that's a major distinction. But I think it really comes down to real applications, right? What
mhm,
do you want in the end of the day? For example, we're talking about language learning. What do you want, right? You want to elicit more user utterances, right? It can be any
mhm,
different ways to elicit for just practice purposes. But if you wanted to elicit specific things, then, oh, do you have a task? Yes, you do, right? But you also want to make sure that they are engaged in this conversation. So you also want to make sure that you answer correctly, coherently with them, right? If you're just
mhm.
like a one-way controlling the conversation, asking questions all the time, it's not interesting anymore. It's not like an engaging conversation because it's a
Yeah.
one-way interview. It's not a conversation. So it really depends on the application, but I totally agree because
Mhm,
of the large language model, there is a way that we can sort of combine these two together and sort of like it doesn't have to be, oh, I'm just purely doing social. I don't do any tasks. Or it's just like
mhm,
I only do tasks, I don't do any social. Because as a human, right, we jump from one thing to the other. And it's very natural for us to do so. And I think like the machine, in the end of the day, if you want to use it as a natural interface, should be able to do that too. Should be
mhm,
able to
mhm,
know and plan well to see when to insert it in what task. Based on the task description, how do you plan ahead of time? Based on like social information, people, you wanted to do adaptations with respect to
mhm,
this person's personality or like background or anything related.
mhm, mhm. Yeah. So um, maybe another question about what are some messages that you would want to give to the machine learning community? For example, like what are some could be like some of the things that are missing from the literature, and it's important enough for having reliable, useful dialogue systems that the community is not paying attention to yet. Are there any such things that you can think of?
Yeah. So Um, it's kind of like a so I have to rant about that previous dialogue
Mhm,
system data sets, like for example, multi-WAS, right? It was great
mhm,
before because it was a nice like a multi-domain thing, but it doesn't really
mhm,
it doesn't have a good evaluation metric because
mhm,
it's not dynamic, right? It has a lot of sort of constraints in terms of evaluating how well a machine learning model is. So
mhm,
I've
mhm,
seen people like come into the dialogue area just using multi-WAS as a benchmark and trying to
mhm,
manipulate the score to show that your algorithm is better. But there are a lot of issues with the data set with the evaluation metric. So this is sort of cautionary tale. If you want to do dialogue, don't optimize your metric on multi-one data set by itself. You should also think about other data sets and really think about whether the algorithm works or not. It's not because the data set was set up this way, or the metric was set up this way. So this is, and ideally, we really wish you to do human evaluation, which means that you can actually test the system interactively and see if it is actually performing the way that you wanted, instead of using the sort of offline evaluation metric that was inaccurate.
Yeah, that I completely agree with. And it's some data set I do like a lot to use in my research, but you're absolutely right regarding the evaluation. And evaluation is a challenging problem. I think it's a challenging problem has been a challenging problem for dialogues in some time. I think it's becoming more accurate.
We have a new paper coming out soon. We already submitted to ACO as well. So it was trying to redo these kind of data sets that has a more like an interactive metric and has all the database search logged into the data set. So it's not randomly picking items from the data set, but it's based on the actual database like results. So everything is more controlled, more accurate, and you can not only interact with the database, but also interact with any type of web pages, because you can think about, like, this is basically very similar to this tool former idea, but we're not directly interacting with APIs, but we're interacting directly with the web structure. For example, we're pressing the button on 3050, we're searching the database with the keyword of like a Sunday, right? These kind of various things that we look at, so that you actually can test it, because you can complete the task, right? So when you're training a model, you can complete the task. You got the thing booking correctly, and then you actually did it right. Otherwise, if you just do offline, you just relying on the surface form of the text instead of the internal action, then you can never get the correct evaluation.
I see. I'll be on the lookout for that paper. Hopefully it will be out before, because I think the ACL decisions are before the iClear. So I'll be on the lookout.
Hopefully we're okay there.
and then one last question. So what are some of the things that I haven't asked, like I should be asking, that you can think of? Or what are some maybe notable papers that I should still think of mentioning? I did list some in my contact email, like Toolformer, as you mentioned, is one of them. Chain of Thought is another one. But is there anything that I should be asking about? Because I'll still interview a bunch of other people.
I can think a little bit. So I have a paper that was Microsoft research. I think I would recommend is on improving faithfulness of the generational results based on knowledge. So we're basically doing recurring some knowledge, and then integrate that knowledge, sort of using some human feedback, like sort of retrain RL models to improve the faithfulness. I think it's important to sort of various different ways to augment existing language model, right? So using these kind of extra methods that you don't have to know exactly what is this language model. You can just take it as it is and improve it over time. I think that's important. And of course, there is various interesting things about like how to improve various abilities of the current large language model. So one thing that we are trying to do at the moment, I think other people are also looking at, is about self-correction. Like, how can the model correct itself, so that you get sort of like a more interesting traces that you can use it over time to improve the model itself. I think there's also interesting things that I've seen, and also what we have been doing is trying to decompose a task to various steps, and then every steps can be calling a base model, that existing model of NLP or any large language model. So you're basically decomposing the task to make it easier for the model, but the decomposing in itself should be generated by the model too, right? So this is like a very interesting field that we're looking at the moment. And the other part, I think I would emphasize is on explanation,
Mhm.
transparency
Mm.
model. I
Mhm.
think that's very interesting about like if the explanation and the prediction or generation is consistent, faithful towards each other, right? Um, More and more people have been working on these days on efficient modelings, right? How to
Mhm.
make the model training in itself more efficient. I think that everybody is looking at in various different ways. I think that's very
Mhm.
interesting. Also, one of the things that we're working together with other machine learning people, I think is extremely important, is on memorization.
Mm.
If you a model predicted this result, what is it based on? Based is it
Mm.
which data points in the training data contributed most to such
Mhm.
prediction? Is the model memorizing such data points? So we're looking at various ways for this kind of memorization issues.
Mm. Mm. I see. I see. Okay. Interesting. So great. Thank you so much. It was a very good discussion. I appreciate it a lot. And let me stop the recording.
Yes.
And okay.